All right, welcome. Welcome to this really, truly extraordinary day we have in store for you. Several of us just came back on a plane from the American Society of International Law, and the buzz there is about this amazing Cleveland Simulation Conference, which is going to have faux news broadcasts and the real players discussing the real issues and Q&A and audience participation. This is really going to be a conference that nobody here forgets. Well, I am Professor Michael Scharf, the director of the Frederick K. Cox Center, and together with Professor Amos Guiora, the director of the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy, we welcome you, and we have a special presentation to kick off today's session. There is one of us in this room who had an extraordinarily great deal to do with the creation of the international law programs at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In fact, he's the person who recruited both myself and Professor Guiora, and so this conference and us would not be here today if not for him. This individual has done so much for the law school and the university community, and he is now going to be leaving us to become the dean of the University of Utah School of Law, where he is going to do great things and his presence is going to be sorely missed. So we thought it would be appropriate to begin today's session by giving a special presentation and gift in honor of our colleague who will do the welcome today, the Associate Dean of Case Western Law School, Hiram Chodosh. Do you want to say something about this?
Good morning. Just one word to add to what Professor Scharf said. Dean Chodosh is truly an innovator. In many ways, what today's conference is all about is innovation. And so in many ways, today is really a reflection of you, and that's why we decided to honor you today.
All right. This really beautiful teardrop-shaped thing that you will have to carry all the way over with you to Utah says, presented with appreciation to Hiram Chodosh, Associate Dean, and Joseph Hostetler, Professor of Law, and Cox Center Director from 1998 to 2003. We really appreciate everything you've done, and we'll miss you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thank you. For the first time in 13 years, I'm speechless. I was reading in the paper this morning that in 2000, Jack Abramoff was nominated for a Cosmos Club membership and quickly made a call to a friend of his, a rabbi who leads a very well-known organization in Washington, and asked him whether he might come up with an award for him because he was nervous because this club had many Nobel laureates and he was quite insecure about joining this club without any of his own awards. And so I guess if I'm ever nominated for the Cosmos Club, I don't have to worry. Call Michael and Amos and ask them to give me some sort of posthumous award. I am very, very deeply touched. Let me just say, and by word of introduction to the conference, that in my view, what we've been trying to do here for the last several years is to dedicate the law school and our global programs, as well as their other distinguished centers like the Law Medicine Center, to improve the human condition, through our core competence of shedding light on the critical issues of our day in a proactive way, not as so many people in government do in a reactive way, but to make use of the luxury we have in academics to look ahead to major problems and to try to contribute to them by bringing the world's greatest experts together here in Cleveland to develop venues and formats in which they can interact with our great audiences, both here physically with us as well as virtually through our webcast. When I stepped down from the center, some of my colleagues said to me, well, Hiram, isn't this going to be a little difficult for you to step down from the International Law Center and hand it over to Michael Scharf? And I said, well, no, not at all. I said, because Michael Scharf is going to take the center to new heights. And Michael, in combination with so many dear colleagues, we have now approximately 25 faculty in this law school involved in some way with our center, whether through collaboration with Professor Mehlman's Law Medicine Center and Jessica Berg and Sharona Hoffman and Jesse Hill and others, as well as through the new efforts of, most recent efforts of Amos Guiora. There's nothing that I'm prouder of then watching Michael and Amos and so many others outstrip and surpass any modest contributions that I've made to this law school. And I look forward to watching the continued growth and commitment and the deepening of that commitment through this and many other future programs to come. So I am deeply touched and honored by this acknowledgement of my modest contributions. And I'd like to dedicate this back not only to all of you, but to the people in our society who might stand to benefit someday, in however an attenuated way, from the kinds of things that we've done, the kinds of exciting things that you're doing and meaningful things that you're doing today, and for all the programs and innovations for the future for this law school. So thank you very much, Michael, Amos, and all of you here today. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm supposed to take this away? Okay. My name is Max Mehlman. I'm the director of the Law Medicine Center here at Case School of Law, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the center, one of the co-sponsors of today's program. One of the great things about this law school and this university is the opportunity to combine different disciplines and interests in pursuit of the public good, and this conference eminently represents the coming together of that kind of synergy. It represents the interest of the Law Medicine Center is especially in the connection between our efforts to fight the war on terror and the pursuit of the public health. Public health measures, as you know, are responsible for many of the greatest triumphs over disease and human suffering. In the 19th century, the creation of clean water and sewage, the reduction of germs, and on and on. But it's also important to remember that in the history of this country, 2 cases involving the public health have come to the Supreme Court of the United States. One of them in 1905 was Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which upheld the authority of the government to require mandatory vaccination for smallpox, one of the important steps in eradicating that scourge from our country and indeed the world. But the other case was Buck versus Bell, the 1927 case in which the Supreme Court upheld a Virginia law that permitted the forced sterilization of people who were mistakenly thought to be feeble-minded. And that law turned out, as many of you probably know, to be the model for the first law that Hitler signed into law when he took office as the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. So I think it's important as we listen to the measures today that we need to take in order to keep our country safe and to promote the public's health, to remember that the public welfare includes not only its health but also its liberty. And with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Amos Guiora, the director of the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy.
Good morning. When we started thinking about this conference a little over a year ago, we were not sure what aspect of bioterrorism to address. After much thought and research, we decided to focus on agriculture and the nation's food supply. The question is why? And the answer is pretty simple. Because most of us, when we think about agriculture, we don't think about bioterrorism. Rather, we think about stories we hear in the news, smallpox, anthrax. Our fundamental purpose today is simply to educate you and the rest of the public through the webcast. To that end, I request that all of you, if you will, step outside of the box, because we're going to conduct this today in a very innovative, very different kind of fashion, and I really do request just leave the traditional box and put it aside. We will explore a simulated terrorist-induced outbreak of foot and mouth disease. We'll have 3 mini lectures by 3 experts. And from there, we will move into 4 different focus groups. There'll be a local aspect, state aspect, national, and international. Each session starts with a short video. And then we will introduce the experts, and I will ask all the experts different questions. I need to add, none of the experts know what we're going to ask them. Because of the complexity of the topic and our many experts, it is impossible to touch upon every aspect of foot and mouth disease and agri-terrorism. We request respectfully, that all of our experts keep their comments very brief because of the incredible time crunch today. Furthermore, we need to make sure that our very distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Gostin, gets to the airport in order to catch his flight. After each session, there will be a short question and answer period. In addition, during the breaks, all of you are invited to ask the speakers whatever questions you would like to ask them. I emphasize the following. One, this is nothing but a simulation. There actually is going to be no real outbreak, at least not today and not here. With that, I wish to extend personal thanks to two different groups of people. Number one are the experts who have taken the time, some of them who've been very involved in helping us prepare this, others who have flown in especially for this. From my perspective, it is indeed an honor that all of you have joined us. The second person I would like to thank is my research fellow, Aaron Page. Aaron Page is a third-year law student who is truly the brains behind this entire thing. We were counting today. We started working on this mid-March last year. Aaron, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. I introduce at this point Dr. Leah Dorman, our first expert.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Leah Dorman, and we're going to talk about foot and mouth disease. I want you to have just a general basis of what the disease is about and how it spreads. It's important for the rest of the day. You probably will see some graphic pictures this morning, but foot and mouth disease is graphic. And some of these pictures are taken from the UK in 2001. Do I need a microphone? Yeah. Sorry, I'm not used to holding still, so. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm going to move this up, but I'm also going to be standing in front of my slides. Okay. Can I just talk loud? Can everybody hear me? Oh, here's the webcast. Let's try this. Better? Sorry, too much? All right. We'll get organized here this morning. Well, foot and mouth disease is a disease that affects cloven-hoofed animals. And cloven-hoofed animals are the animals that you see here. Cattle, sheep, and pigs are really the main species that it affects. It is highly contagious amongst those animals. It is inactivated either at a low or a high pH. So what that means is it is fairly easy to inactivate. And that's one of the good things about, one of the only good things about this virus. It does survive in many different bodily fluids. Almost every bodily fluid from an infected animal can transmit foot and mouth disease. It is a picornavirus. There are 7 distinct serotypes and many other subtypes which are not cross-protective. So meaning if you get infected with one, or if an animal gets infected with one, then they are not necessarily protected from a different strain of the same virus. Just to give you an idea of what the history is like, we have not seen foot and mouth disease here in the United States since 1929. You can see that there's been other outbreaks. We were a bit involved in a UK outbreak. A colleague of mine at the Ohio Department of Agriculture went to the UK to help eradicate the disease with them. To give you an idea of what agriculture is like in Ohio, you can see that's fairly large industry. It's $80 billion. 1 in every 7 jobs is ag-related. And Ohio is not a huge state. We're a small state, but we do have a lot of people. So it at least gives you an idea of what ag looks like in Ohio. On the other hand, and more specifically, let's look at the livestock in Ohio. I'm not going to read through these, but one of the things that I think surprises people the most is that we are second in the nation in table egg production. So we have a lot of chickens here in Ohio. Some of the potential economic ramifications of this disease are listed here. Direct costs, obviously, economic loss to the producers. Eradication costs. This is a disease that we don't want to live with. This is a disease that if it came here, we would want to get rid of as quickly as possible. And part of that is because of the indirect costs, and those indirect costs would be the costs that of our exports, because our exports would be shut down. To give you an idea of what countries are typically live with foot and mouth disease, you'll see the blue countries. Those countries either have foot and mouth disease or vaccinate for foot and mouth disease. The pink countries, and you'll see North America is entirely pink, is foot and mouth disease free, and we do not practice vaccination. Australia also is another country. Morbidity and mortality. And morbidity is the number of animals that are affected. We talked about this disease is very, very highly contagious to other animals. And nearly, if you have foot and mouth disease, nearly 100% of the herd or the flock is going to be infected. It is just simply that contagious. And we talked about susceptible animal populations. Well, here in the United States, here in North America in general, all animals are susceptible because we have not had this disease for a very long time. Animals typically do not die with this disease. If they're very young animals, there are certain highly virulent strains that sometimes can cause death in animals. But for the most part, animals typically recover. They do sometimes get a secondary infection. Their immune system gets so busy fighting the virus of foot and mouth disease that it kind of opens up the door for other bacterial infections or other viral infections that may simply be in the herd or flock. The way that foot and mouth disease is transmitted is mainly through respiratory and certainly direct contact, and then there's indirect. So there's really lots of ways. We talked about the disease and the virus can be in every bodily fluid, and that includes the breath and any saliva that may come out. It can survive 1 to 2 days in the human respiratory tract, so it is something that people do not necessarily get, but certainly can be in their trachea. And if they would be exposed to foot and mouth disease and have that virus that is in their trachea, even though it's not affecting them, they certainly could, if they were exposed to other, if they were exposed to other livestock, they could potentially transmit that. Whenever I have worked with foot and mouth disease, we go on a voluntary quarantine, and where I do not handle other animals for at least a week. And that's just a precaution that we do. That's what we call a biosecurity measure. Direct contact would be ingestion of infected animal parts, and hence the reason that customs dig through your stuff every time you go out of the country. This is why. We want to make sure that any meat products, we hope you don't bring meat products. Why? Because we want to make sure that there aren't diseases that could potentially be harbored in that meat, that if somehow got to our livestock through various channels, it could certainly affect them. And certainly artificial insemination, we talked about any body fluids from those livestock, and hormones certainly could transmit the disease. And even more importantly, the indirect contact via fomites. And fomites is just a kind of a word that means transmission through people, through equipment. And by people, I mean their clothing, their boots, or even brushes or anything that you may use on a farm. Foot and mouth disease is not a public health concern. There have been 40 cases in humans ever. Humans, though, like we talked about, are transmitters. They don't actually get the disease necessarily, but they can transmit it on their clothing, on their boots, and also through equipment. Clinical signs, and here's where we get to a bit more graphic. In general, in the species, you see fever, and you also see blisters. Incubation period. An incubation period means the time that an animal is exposed to the time that they actually show signs and symptoms of the disease. An incubation period is pretty quick. It can be as short as 48 hours. So it's important that we find the disease, know about the disease, and move quickly. It can be as long as 12 days. Again, some of that is strain dependent. These blisters we talked about, and you can see right here, there's a circular area, and that actually was a blister that then ruptured, and then we get this erosion, or just this lesion that's left. You can see abortion. We talked about the death in young animals, and lots of times they do recover, but many can get a secondary infection. Specific signs in cattle. Cattle are the indicator animals. They have a tendency to show the signs of the disease first. So we have a tendency to see it quicker in them. Usually you see blisters on the tongue. What's this animal doing here? He's salivating. Why? Gosh, have you ever had a canker sore? Babies cutting teeth, what do? They drool. Same reason. These mouths are very painful, and so they do have excessive salivation. If they have some blisters up here, sometimes you'll even see some nasal discharge. Also, you can get teat lesions. That's important in a dairy farm because you get a large decrease in milk production. Not only are they fighting a disease and causing fever, which tends to decrease production, but we also get these blisters that then erode on the end of the teat, and that's actually the udder of a cow. So you can see how sore that teat is. Also, hoof lesions, and why is it called foot and mouth disease? Because you tend to get foot lesions and you tend to get mouth lesions. Interdigital space is just the area between the toes, and we'll see some pictures of that in pigs. They have a tendency to get a little more severe foot lesions. And typically they progress to a lameness because their feet hurt. In pigs are the amplifier animals. These are the animals that are virus factories. They produce millions and shed millions of viral particles in their saliva, in their feces, again, any of their bodily fluids. Hoof lesions, again, tend to be a bit more severe in cattle than in cattle, and it does cause a lameness. You see this pig sitting down. They do get snout blisters that then, again, a lot of times you don't see the blisters. Those don't last very long. Those then rupture and then become an erosion, or just a sore that's left. They do get some oral blisters, but not very often. This is a typical presentation here in a pig. What's that pig doing? He's down on his front end, and why? And you notice his feet are slung way under here, and he's down on his knees in the front because his feet hurt. He's got some terrible feet lesions, and so he is trying to get off his feet as much as he can. This is just an example of the lesions. You actually can see there used to be vesicles up here, or there used to be blisters right up here, right above the hoof. And then what happens is those break and rupture. Lots of times you get a secondary infection there, and they can actually even begin sloughing this entire hoof. So their hoof actually comes off. It'd be like losing our fingernails. Sheep tend to hide. Sheep and goats tend to hide the disease. So they are kind of our great masqueraders of foot and mouth disease. The signs are very mild. They can get some fever. They may get some oral lesions, but usually pretty mild. The bad part about that, and if we compare things to the United Kingdom, they have a lot of sheep over there, and those were animals that had the disease and were harboring it and spreading it, but didn't necessarily show signs very quickly. So they can be our great masqueraders. There is really no treatment available. It's a viral disease. So supportive care certainly is something to those that may be affected. U.S. outbreak, if we had an outbreak here in the U.S., certainly could result in quarantine, euthanizing animals in order to stamp out the disease, and which would lead to disposal issues. There is a vaccine available. We don't have enough time to talk about vaccine here. Really, that is a decision made by the USDA, and certainly the ramifications are many. In Ohio, and actually nationally, foot and mouth disease is in the OIE, or the Office of International Epizooties, reportable disease list. And certainly in Ohio, this is our reportable disease list. And the numbers you will see referenced here, and Bill Hopper will go into this in a bit more detail, is from the Ohio Revised Code. And we have a reportable disease law, and in that, obviously, foot and mouth disease is on that list. What that means is that anybody who sees the disease, whether it be a producer, whether it be a layperson, whether it be a veterinarian, is required to report that to a veterinarian or to the Ohio Department of Agriculture or the USDA. And those are the numbers that they could call. Prevention. There are many things that we're doing for prevention. We're doing things like this. So we're teaching people about the disease and what to look for. But one of the big things on our borders is USDA has very strict import restrictions. We do not import ruminants, live ruminants, and ruminants are cattle, sheep, and goats mainly. We don't import ruminants or swine and any of their products from foot and mouth disease affected countries. Why? Because certainly they could harbor the virus and we could bring it over here. So again, why do those people check out your belongings when you go through customs? It's for disease control reasons. We do have biosecurity protocols for livestock facilities. Most livestock facilities have their own biosecurity protocol, but we certainly play a role in trying to educate them and helping them get one prepared. We also have 450. This stands for Foreign Animal Disease Diagnosticians to investigate suspicious lesions. Now, that's not in Ohio. That is across the nation. I am one of those foreign animal disease diagnosticians, and what that means is it's a veterinarian that has had some additional training that have seen these diseases. We've seen many of the foreign animal diseases in order to be able to diagnose them. So once we get a report or a call about a suspicious case of foot and mouth disease or any foreign animal disease, the first thing that happens is a foreign animal disease diagnostician goes out to the farm and investigates, and we go from there. We also have a state plan. In your handout, you will find the Animal Disease Incident Annex. That is a document that is a living document, meaning that it changes. It changes as we know more and learn more, and I spent my entire last week updating that document. So you will see that you have the old one. Certainly the one that I'm working on is not for print yet. It's still in very draft form. But we also then, it's great if you have a plan, but if you don't test out the plan, you don't know if your plan's any good. So we have also done some training exercise to see if this plan really works. We've used, in the Animal Disease Incident Annex, we use a series of groups, and you can see the groups here. I'm going to run through them very briefly. We have 11 groups. One of the groups is the Public Information and Rumor Control Group. And this is a group that would set up the Joint Information Center at the Emergency Operations Center. So you'll see some of these acronyms. I'll try and explain those, and if I miss something, please let me know. And really what they do is make sure that guidance, alerts, warnings are ready for the public, and then they also speak in one voice. You know, when we have a disease like this, there's typically one person that speaks, and that's what our communications or our public information officer would do. They would handle all media-related topics. And then also a toll-free number would be available to answer any questions about this disease. You'll see some pictures as we go along, and some of these pictures are from our exercise that we did a year and a half ago. And this is just an example of what some of the public information. Now, this one is not foot and mouth disease, but it's certainly about BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is also commonly known as mad cow. So this is just an example of some of the things that we try to avoid. We try to avoid misinformation. The surveillance group, these are the folks that would conduct investigations. So we would have some veterinarians and maybe some animal health technicians go out and conduct investigations and look. We want to look at the epidemiology. We want to look and see what's going on at the farm and what animals are moving where, and monitor all the premises in high-risk areas. Indemnification and appraisal group. These are the folks that determine value of livestock. If we would have to euthanize animals, those animals have to be appraised before they can be removed from the farm. Many times that's a federal indemnity. Animal euthanasia group. That fellow right there is standing there with a captive bolt gun. And what we want to do is euthanize animals in a humane manner. If we have to remove animals from a farm for any reason, that needs to be done humanely. Just another picture of some on-farm work. Once you have animals euthanized, you also will need to dispose of them. And we do have law that says that how we need to dispose of animals. Bill will get into that a little bit deeper, but we have several ways we can do that. And you saw here, again, that's a picture of the UK. This is some of the pyres that they built there. Burning can be certainly an option for disposal. Rendering can be an option. And rendering is, you'll notice in this picture that is a dump truck. And we have some euthanized animals in there, and it is lined. Burying is another way, and then composting is another option for that, for disposal. Decontamination group, it's very important. Again, because this is a highly contagious disease, we need to disinfect the premises, equipment, and vehicles before we move from farm to farm. And you'll notice he's even spraying off the hose that we drug across the pasture in order to spray a barn out. So every piece has to be cleaned up before we move. Biosecurity training group provides biosecurity to personnel at the site. We need to train everybody as they come in because law enforcement folks, certainly people who are not used to dealing with these kinds of biohazards, we want to be sure to teach them the proper way of getting on and off a farm. We also have a veterinary support group. We have some people that can help us find folks to help us in the events of an emergency. And we have something called the Ohio Veterinary Emergency Responders that certainly can fill in some of those gaps, because we will run out of people very quickly in the event of a disease. And the quarantine group would provide written quarantines to the affected premises. That's what a quarantine looks like. Law enforcement group would enforce the legal requirements, enforce embargoes on the animals. So we would make sure that animals coming into the state, if another state had foot and mouth disease, we wouldn't want them here in Ohio. And the same thing about products, because milk and other food products certainly may carry the disease into Ohio, so we would want to stop that from happening. Recovering reimbursement is very important, and then also the mental health concerns for animal owners, response, and recovery personnel. If you see this, and this is your life stream, is to have this huge hog operation, and these animals have to be euthanized as part of an eradication plan, we definitely will need some mental health, not only for the people who have to do this, but also for the people whose animals are the animal owners. Just some resources. I'd like to introduce Bill Hopper. He's our Chief Legal Counsel for ODA, and he's going to talk a bit about the legal aspects.
Have to be looking at my book and doing this. It's sort of like chewing gum and rubbing your stomach for me, who I'm kind of technically deficient. So bear with me. We'll see how it goes. Prior to the exercise today, we thought it would be helpful to give a brief overview of the statutory authority in Ohio with respect to disease control. Disease control with respect to both plants and animals rests with the Director of Agriculture. For plants, the pertinent chapter is 927, which deals with the authority to seize, quarantine, and dispose of materials containing plants or plant pests the Director feels necessary to control or eradicate. For animals, Chapter 941 provides similar authority. 941 also grants the Governor the authority to embargo disease or infected animals from being imported into Ohio from another state. As the scenario today deals with animals, we'll be looking primarily at Chapter 941. The key sections of 941 dealing with disease-infected animals are 941.06, dealing with the reporting of diseases and prohibited transfers. 07, dealing with investigations and quarantine. 941.10, providing prohibitions on importation. 941.11, outlining orders for destruction. 941.12, providing the appraisal process. 14 and 15, treating methods of disposal. And 941.99, penalties. Critical to triggering the key provisions of Chapter 941 is the presence of a dangerously contagious or infectious disease. Two ways such diseases are declared are, one, by rule, for those that are well-known or established, or through an executive order for previously unknown or exotic diseases. What I'd like to do then is run through very briefly the statutory steps in the disease control process. First, notice is required to be made by any person who suspects the existence of a dangerously contagious or infectious disease to the director or to a licensed veterinarian who who is then required to immediately report the disease to the Department of Agriculture. The next is the determination phase. Once the director is notified, he must determine whether the suspected disease is a dangerously contagious or infectious disease as listed in the Ohio Administrative Code. If not, then the disease must be declared as a contagious disease through an emergency executive order. If yes, then we move immediately to Chapter 941.07, which is the embargo quarantine process. In the investigation phase, if it is determined that we are dealing with a dangerously contagious or infectious disease, then the director may quarantine the animal and/or the geographic area in which the animal is located so that we are able to inspect, test, and examine the animal and other animals in the area. If the animal is infected with or exposed to a dangerously contagious disease, the director may issue quarantine orders without a prior hearing in order to prevent such diseases from affecting other animals in the state of Ohio or the public health. Failure to comply with the terms and conditions of the quarantine order is a criminal offense. We attempt, when possible, to notify the owner prior to any quarantine order, and normally the order is delivered personally by a veterinarian. The quarantine order contains the name and address of the person who owns the quarantine animal, the animal's description, a description of the premises affected by the quarantine, the reason for the quarantine, the terms and conditions of the quarantine, which is often a very key element of the quarantine itself, and the notice of a right to hearing with respect to the quarantine order for the affected person. The hearing may be requested within 30 days after the order is issued, but does not stay the quarantine order. A quarantine order remains in effect until a written notice of release is issued by the ODA or until ordered to be removed after hearing. The department's expenses are paid by the state, but do not include the maintenance, feeding, and quartering of the animal while in quarantine. Another key provision to consider in conjunction with the quarantine order is 941.05. This provides that no animal shall be brought to or removed from the premises or geographic area without written permission from the director. Violation of 941.05 is again a criminal offense. In addition, 941.05 provides that any law enforcement officer of the state or a political division thereof shall assist in the enforcement of Chapter 941 when requested to do so by the Director of Agriculture. Chapter 941, in addition to the powers granted to the Director of Agriculture, also empowers the governor to ban importation of diseased animals from other states. It also authorizes the director, when an animal is moved into the state in violation of any applicable federal or state law, to quarantine the animal, order the animal returned to the point of origin, or order the animal sent to slaughter. Once the animal or animals are quarantined, the next issue is what to do with it. 941.11 provides that the director may, without prior hearing, order the destruction of any animal infected with or exposed to a dangerously contagious or infectious disease. Again, failure to comply is a criminal offense. When possible, the Department will provide notice to the owner of the destruction order. The destruction order must contain the following: a description of the animal, the reason for the order, a reasonable deadline for compliance, a notice of hearing, and the name and address of the owner or custodian when known. A person subject to the destruction order may request a hearing. However, the hearing may not delay the execution of the destruction order. (941) also provides for an appraisal process for animals subject to the destruction order. Note, however, that payment by the state is discretionary and is also dependent upon availability of funding. Finally, Chapter 941 provides for the disposal of animals destroyed under its provisions. Generally, the disposal is accomplished either through burial or burning of the animal. That is a very brief overview of the statutory process in Chapter 941 with respect to disease control. At this point, then, that concludes our look at 941, and Assistant Attorney General Tammy Little will now provide an overview of the role of the Ohio EMA in the arena of animal terrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning again, everyone. I'm Tammy Little. I represent the Ohio Emergency Management Agency. I'm here today with my colleagues C.J. Couch, the Public Information Officer, and Mel House, the Operations Division Director. We thought it would be helpful in this exercise or facilitated discussion to give you just a little bit of an overview of what the Emergency Management Agency would do to support the Department of Agriculture in the event something like this occurred within our state or in an adjacent state. Most of our actions take place within what we call the Emergency Operations Plan. It's a statewide plan that was recently amended and repromulgated by the governor, in fact, just this week. As Dr. Dorman said, these plans are living documents. We revise them all the time based on what we either learn in real life or through exercise or through updates that we receive from our partner agencies. There is a base plan in our Emergency Operations Plan that describes the purpose and scope. There are 15 what we call ESFs, or Emergency Support Functions. There are 2 support annexes, and then there are 7 incident annexes, of which Dr. Dorman described earlier to you, the Animal Disease Annex. The purpose of the plan is to have documented systems which will manage prompt and efficient delivery of services, coordinate those state resources as needed to the local governments, preserve the health and safety and welfare of the people and the population and their property, and provide as many resources as are necessary to respond to the incident, whatever it might be it flood, natural disaster, terrorism, or an animal incident, disease such as this. It also provides and describes a system for responding to emergencies and assigns specific functional responsibilities to all of our state agency partners and our local agency partners. Each emergency support function has a lead agency, or perhaps in some instances more than one lead agency, and many support agencies who provide resources and additional personnel or stuff, if you will, equipment at the time of an emergency to the lead state agency involved. The Emergency Operations Plan in the state of Ohio has integrated the National Emergency Management System as its guide to responding. That provides for a very well-known, very common system of coordination of local, state, and federal assets. Describes, again, the roles and responsibilities. And we use the Emergency Operations Center located in Columbus as a multi-agency coordination center. The National Emergency Management System, or NIMS, integrates a common language, interoperable communication systems, a unified and area command, which would be very important in a situation like this where we may very well have disease throughout different parts of the state of Ohio, whereas a flood or a tornado might only impact one small part of the state. The county, you will hear from Buck Adams from Medina County, also has an emergency operations plan that's again coordinated not only with the state plan, but also with the National Response Plan, so that all of us, again, are talking a common language. To briefly jump to where we might be with the disease that Dr. Dorman has described, we would work very closely with Dr. Brisker and Director Daly at the Department of Agriculture, and when the need arose, we would certainly assess the situation. If it got to the point where the Emergency Operations Center was opened and our state and local and federal partners were called to join us there, we probably would have a local declaration of emergency. That would be the first step. All disasters, no matter whether they're natural or human-caused or disease-caused, all start at the local level. Once they realize that their resources might be overwhelmed, we would certainly get the state involved, and the State Emergency Operations Center would be open. We would call together all of the appropriate state agencies within that emergency support function and move from there. If we determine then, through talking with Dr. Daly, or Director Daly, excuse me, that governor's declaration was necessary, that would be the next step. We would approach his office, describe the circumstances, and indicate that some additional state support or a stronger presence of state agency support needs to be brought to bear on the circumstances. Again, from there, moving up the ladder, if the state's resources are overwhelmed or we realize that we would need assistance from the federal government, the governor can request that the president declare either an emergency or a major disaster declaration. Those things are all described in the Stafford Act, which is found within the United States Code. To wrap up this introduction real briefly, there are, of the support and the emergency support functions and the annex that Dr. Dorman described, agriculture has a supporting role in 5 of them, would certainly assist the state with mass care, other public health emergencies, certainly hazardous materials incidents, and also would sit within the Joint Information Center to make sure that the appropriate public information is getting out and that rumors are controlled. The Animal Disease Annex is certainly our guide, and that would be what we would use to respond, taking our lead, of course, from Director Daly and his staff at the Department of Agriculture. Emergency management personnel and other state agency personnel would then support their needs as necessary. So with that, that's a little very, very brief overview of what the Emergency Management Agency would do, and Dr. Guiora will move on, I guess, from there.
Thank you for your participation today in this news conference. We have received information that an unnamed terrorist organization is planning a biological attack on our soil. Sources tell us that the attack has already commenced. Please be aware of any unusual activity. Thank you very much.
One small request, there is some cell phone that's ringing. If we can kill the cell phones before, that'd be helpful. Our first panel is Dr. Dorman, who we've already heard, Dr. Brisker, and Mr. Yarsh, who is our farmer. It is an honor, sir, that you have joined us today. Mr. Yarsh is a dairy farmer who milks 60 cows a day. His farm is located in Lorain County near Grafton, Ohio. The same day as the press statement we just heard, advising citizens to be aware of events out of the ordinary, Mr. Yarsh notices that his cows are eating poorly, and a few of them are drooling. Mr. Yarsh, the question to you is, what would you do? You have 4 options. 1, would you begin treatment with over-the-counter medication? Would you call your vet? Talk to friends, neighbors? Combination of the above, or none of the above?
I'd call the vet immediately.
And what would you tell the vet, sir?
Well, what do I witness, what I see, and then it's up to him to diagnose what my problem is.
So the first thing you call the vet, have him come over, look at the animals.
Right.
Okay. We're going to take what Mr. Yarsh just told us and move 3 days ahead. just like that. It has been 2 days, sir, since you first noticed something strange with your cows. And this morning, the third morning, you find 3 heifer calves, about 4 to 6 months old, dead. You also notice that some of your cattle are not eating very much. Milk production has dropped dramatically, and you're having trouble getting the cows into the milking parlor due to problems with their feet. Here, sir, also, what do you do? 3 questions. Self-treatment, consult with the vet, or dispose of the dead animals and try to conceal the problem.
In my situation, when I had a dairy, anytime I had a problem, I went to the vet immediately. I had one scenario that with this mad cow disease was here in the United States, and I had one cow that was drooling after I read the article in a magazine or something. I called my vet immediately, and he handled it from there, and luckily it was just a cold or something, so it was nothing. But the minute I thought I had a problem, I got on the phone.
And trying to conceal the animals is something, sir, that you would never try to do?
No.
Okay. So in terms of our simulation, where are we now? Mr. Yarish has called his vet, and our vet is a Dr. Sam Jones. Dr. Jones comes to Mr. Yarish's farm, and here's what he sees. He finds that 75% of the animals are feverish, 25% are having trouble walking. He also notices that half of the cattle are drooling and have blisters, either ruptured or intact, in their mouths. That afternoon, Dr. Jones calls the Ohio Department of Agriculture and reports his findings as required by law to the state vet. Dr. Jones also advises you not to move any livestock. Question again to you, sirs, what are you going to do? You're going to ignore the advice, consult with friends, or do exactly as the vet tells you?
I would do exactly as the vet told me because I couldn't afford to lose my farm over that situation.
And if the vet told you something that you disagreed with, you would still do as told?
Still do as told.
All right. Dr. Brisker, sir, you as the Deputy Director of the Ohio Department of Agriculture, what would you do about the situation that Mr. Yarish has just been describing?
Well, the first thing I would do would be to compliment him on compliance with the law. We certainly appreciate that and the options that he had as far as hiding or subverting this type of thing. He did the right thing. Our compliments to that. And of course, our colleague, Dr. Jones, should be commended for the same thing. And as we saw in the statute, these are obviously mandatory requirements that they report. The Ohio Department of Agriculture, of course, the call would come to our state veterinarian. At this time, that's Dr. Guiora. Dr. Guiora works hand in glove with our federal counterparts, with USDA, APHIS. Dr. Sue Skorupski currently is the ABIC in Pickerington. And together, they would put a general alert mode into place. They would conference, obviously, on this thing. Part of that conference would be they would call and see the need to involve a foreign animal disease diagnostician, and they would make that call either together or singly to one of our field veterinarians. I believe is Dr. Leah Dorman is one of the federal animal disease diagnostic. She would be called, or one of her colleagues would be called, depending on the area of the state that we were involved with.
Dr. Dorman. There you are, 9 o'clock in the evening, coming to Mr. Yarish's farm. What are you going to do once you get there?
The first thing I'm going to do is talk with Mr. Yarish, find out what's happening, what he's seen. Preferably, if I can, I will actually schedule a time with a veterinarian, with Dr. Jones, Mr. Yarish's veterinarian, and preferably meet with all 3 of them at the farm if schedules permit. The first thing I'll do after talking with them and kind of collecting history, what's happened in the days since you've noticed this, but also I'll begin examining the animals and starting to make a determination of my own. And the other thing I would be doing would be collecting a history. And by history, I mean, have you had any foreign visitors, any folks that have traveled, or people visiting in general that maybe didn't belong here? Have you seen anything suspicious as far as, you know, have you had some locks broken or any break-ins, those type of things? And then also ask about equipment, moving? Has there been any equipment that have moved that you've borrowed from a neighbor, or again, anything that looks a little bit unusual? And again, depending on what I find, if I find the same thing, that, you know, if it looks like foot and mouth disease, certainly I'm going to be very suspicious of that disease. There are other diseases like vesicular stomatitis that looks like foot and mouth disease. So can I on the farm say that this is foot and mouth disease? No, but I can certainly make a professional judgment. And then what happens at that point is, after I've done my history, also examined animals and made a little bit of a professional opinion, what I do then is I would actually get on the phone and call Dr. Glauer, the state veterinarian, and also the area veterinarian in charge, who is the federal veterinarian here in Ohio, and would get on a conference call with them and let them know of my findings. So you will see right off, state and federal ag is involved from the very, very beginning in animal disease because of our reporting. So I get on the phone with them, and we determine how we're going to get these lab samples sent and determine what lab samples will be sent. And then I actually go back and collect the lab samples that would be necessary and prepare them to ship.
So, Mr. Yarsh, sir, back to you after we heard from Dr. Dorman and Dr. Brisker. A number of questions. Have you bought or sold animals recently?
Not in the last 6 months, no.
And have you attended any exhibitions or shows?
No.
And have you had any recent visitors to the farm or moved equipment?
Yes.
Such as?
Well, our place, we run a business out there with tires and stuff, and we have a run shop. We do a lot of tractor mechanic work and stuff, my son and I, and there's people coming and going all the time, so you never know who's going to be there and who isn't going to be. It's a pretty lucrative place. I mean, things are happening all the time, so you never know.
How many visitors do you have in terms of?
Oh, we can have anywhere from 5, 10, 15 farmers a day coming in and out, because we do a lot of tractor work, and they bring their tractor tires to us, and of course they drive in with their trucks that they've been around their farm with. So if something's going to come, there's a good possibility they would bring it, yes.
So in essence, you're having both people and equipment going in and out?
Yes.
Right. So Dr. Orman, back to you. How does that impact and affect what you've been talking about?
That's part of my history. I mean, those are the kinds of things, if we're talking, again, about a highly contagious disease, those are things I want to know, because that's the first place I'm going to look to see if there's any spread, either through, you know, certainly equipment, the tractors that maybe has appeared at his farm, then have moved to somebody else who might have cattle, sheep, goats, or pigs. And could the disease be transmitted that way? Yes, it could. It could, if it was exposed to virus and that virus then was carried to the next farm.
By people and or equipment?
Right.
Right.
On their clothing or...
sorry?
On their clothing, boots, clothes, or
Another
equipment.
thing, if they bring a tractor tire that they've used in the barnyard, there's definitely going to be cow manure on it, so they're going to bring it there. And then, believe me, we get a number of them, and you have to hose them down before you work on them. So it would be a good way to transmit it.
And as a matter of course, you always water it down?
What, the equipment? We always wash the tires and stuff before we mess with them, yes. We got a hot water pressure washer, and we'll wash the stuff off. Even we got a few feeder cattle now, but we still, you know, we try to, I don't know what they got, you know.
Then, Mr. Yarsh, the next question to you is, have either you or your family traveled to any foreign country or had visitors who came to visit you from across the border?
Not recently, no, not that I can think of.
Not that you're aware of, not that you remember. And have you bought any hay or straw recently?
No, I pretty much have my own.
Make your own?
Yes.
And then back to you, Dr. Dorman and Dr. Brisker, how does the fact that Mr. Yarsh produces his own hay rather than bring it into his farm, does that impact anything? Does that have any kind of an impact?
It really doesn't have an impact. I mean, obviously, if he were importing hay or grain from somewhere else, then again, that's another place to look as far as, you know, where disease could enter onto a farm. And those are basic biosecurity issues. And again, that's one of the things up front I would be talking to him about, you know, not wanting to transmit anything from his farm to anyone else's.
How are you going to control, in essence, begin the process of controlling whatever is on Mr. Yarsh's farm doesn't go outside or beyond his farm?
On the suspicion of disease, right. When I am there, and if I suspect foot and mouth disease, I will quarantine the farm.
All right, we'll get into the quarantine later, but so the first, what you're really going to try to do is to control the area, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
All right. How, sir, are you going to respond to that?
Do what the lady says. Like I said before, if I don't do it, I'm going to lose my farm, and that's bottom line, because there's some stiff penalties if you don't play the game. I mean, that's the way it should be.
In light of the fact we have all kinds of sheriffs with us today, you respect the law.
I also have a son-in-law as a state patrol, so I have no choice.
Once we have all this information, back to the two of you, what's going to happen next? In terms of who are you going to call, who are you going to involve in the process now?
Well, again, Dr. Dorman would make the call from the farm relating her findings to Dr. Glauer. Dr. Glauer, of course, would be in immediate communication with Dr. Skorupski, the AVIC, the USDA counterpart. There would be an emergency programs consultation with the with the federal component. That would be, we really don't want to speak for them, but that would be a communication issue that would be launched from their side of the thing. The details of that they would have to deal with. But if we get to this point, then we're probably going to be looking at, there's always a networking going on. I mean, this thing isn't done under a bushel, so to speak. There's networking and the communication is going on all the time. But officially, Dr. Glauer would notify the director of this at the time the quarantine was placed.
And who's updating Mr. Yarish? How does he, as the affected individual, know what's happening?
Well, the veterinarian on site would be our point of communication to him. Dr. Dorman, the foreign animal disease diagnostician. And obviously, as Mr. Yarish said, this is not only do we have a legal issue here, but there's a lot more issues involved with regard to livelihood and doing the right thing with regard to his herd and his neighbor's herd and the Ohio herd, for that matter.
So again, going back to what Dr. Dorman said, the desire is to keep the matter controlled in as small an area as possible.
That's correct. And Mr. Yarish is doing exactly what he needs to do. And, you know, he's looking out for his own well-being and also the well-being of his neighbors' herds. So he's doing the right thing.
And afraid of his son-in-law, the state patrol.
And afraid of his son-in-law. That doesn't...
And he moved on to the farm yet besides, so...
I'm sorry?
I say, and he's moved on to the farm yet besides, so he's got a good eye on me. And like other thing on this here, as you asked me what I would do, you'd have to look the situation over, and I can't believe that any farmer that I know of would want to lose everything he's got for not doing it right. I mean, if they come over and tell me you've got to get rid of all your cows, well, so you've lost $10,000, $100,000. You didn't lose your whole farm, your whole investment, and all your livelihood because you was just greedy enough that you was afraid you was going to do it. So it would be stupid for anybody not to just address the issue through what they tell them and go that route.
And can you foresee any situation where somebody of their own free volition hides animals or simply buries them rather than...
I would think that there would be 99% of your farmers are very good people, but you're always going to have that one element, one person that says, well, you know, I know it's got it. Let's shove them off to a sale somewhere. Let's peddle them on down the road so we don't lose the value of the cattle. We can butcher them. We get that money. They're gone, out of sight, out of mind. Yes, I would say there'd be at least 1% would try to sneak something past.
That's because their son-in-law isn't a highway patrolman.
He wouldn't know a cow if he seen one.
All right. Do you want to add something before? All right.
We do have the ability to trace those kind of things through the markets and things like that. We have the ability to go in and look at those records and audit those records that, you know, if Mr. Yarish was not the upstanding individual that he is and decided to try and hide it, we do have the ability to try and find out those kinds of things.
And I think the nature of this disease would not allow too much secrecy very long because of the short incubation period and the severity of the clinical symptoms that you'd have.
And in terms of your ability to trace, how quickly does that work?
It varies. It varies. You know, if we know where these animals have gone, I mean, we can send somebody out immediately. And the other half of that is that the people that are working in that market certainly know these signs and symptoms of the disease, the same as we do. And it is not unusual to actually get a call from a slaughter plant's worker or from a market, a livestock market, that says, hey, I've got an animal here that potentially has some problems.
All right. At some point, then, the Ohio Emergency Management Agency Director, under advice from the state vet, is going to set in action something called the Crisis Action System level, which I will ask the two of you to talk about, meaning that material is going to be sent on to Plum Island. I'll also ask you to talk about what Plum Island is. And here, by the way, according to how we view it, the samples will be taken to Plum Island by your son-in-law from the Ohio Patrol. So Dr. Brisker, Dr. Dorman, please explain what this crisis action system is and what that means in the context of what we're facing here.
I think Tammy Little discussed the CAS 1, 2, and 3. It's a progressive series of events that's brought to bear that works into activation, communication, activities as they relate to the severity. In this case, a CAS level 1 is based on Dr. Dorman's assessment that we have a highly likely situation here. The samples are pending. And there's a number of things. Dr. Dorman, you may want to contribute some of the specifics of that in our
Again, depending on what I find on the farm and in consultation with the state veterinarian and the area veterinarian in charge, which is the federal counterpart, depending on what we talk about and, again, what I find, what they think, we put a priority level on this lab sample that I'm going to send. And if it's a priority 1, if I say, gosh, this looks like the real deal, this just fits, then that's going to go a priority 1. And that means very likely we're going to have somebody hand carry that lab sample to the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab on Plum Island, which is off the coast of New York, or off the coast of Long Island. It's a government-owned island. That's the only legal place that foot and mouth disease is allowed to be in the U.S. because it's technically not on the continental U.S. because it's on an island all by itself. Their security is very, very high. The only way to get there is by helicopter or ferry. So that's where the samples go, and that is a national lab. So that is a federal lab. It's the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab, or we call it FADL.
FADL or cattle?
FADL. FADL, F-A-D-D-L, Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab. And again, that's really the only place at this point that foot and mouth disease testing is allowed to go on.
And in the meantime, what's happening with Mr. Yarsh? While the check is going on, examination at Plum Island, where's Mr. Yarsh in all of this?
I'm going to be there probably with Mr. Yarsh, and I may have to set up a cot at your place, but
he's very cooperative.
nice corner of the barn would be fine.
Room, no problem.
Cows will keep me warm. We're dealing with this situation, on the farm. Obviously, we want to make sure that animals aren't moving out. We may be taking more lab samples, waiting really for some results. And we really ought to have results in 24 to 48 hours. We ought to have some results.
And where's Dr. Jones, his vet, in this situation?
Well, Dr. Jones would be given the same information that Mr. Yarsh would, and that is, biosecurity-wise, we would highly recommend that, he go home and shower and wash his clothes. And again,
and his car.
And his car, absolutely, when he leaves. And that's very typical for any large animal or food animal veterinarian. I mean, our biosecurity measures that's pretty typical. If you go to a farm, especially if you suspect a disease, it's very common to wash your car upon leaving. And understand that on a daily basis, when I enter a farm, the first thing I do is I have clean coveralls that come out of a clean bag. I have clean boots that I put on. And then the next thing I do is get some water from the farmer. I do not enter the barn. They bring the water out to me. I put disinfectant in, and I actually scrub my boots before I go in. They were perfectly clean before, but it's just, again, an extra precaution. And then when we leave, the same thing. When I remove those coveralls, any gloves, preferably any disposable items, stay on the farm, and then anything clothing-wise that I have on that I do have to take home, I bag up in a dark colored, so I know the difference between the clean and the dirty. I actually bag up into a dark colored bag and toss in my trunk to take home and clean. And again, I scrub out. I mean, and when my hands, my boots are clean, and when I say clean, they better look brand spanking new when they go back in my car. And it sometimes takes me longer to get on a farm and off a farm than it does to actually do what I need to do on the farm.
Dr. Risker, anything to add in terms of?
I might just say at this stage of the game, the EMA and ODA began networking or a communication with some of the players or the stakeholders in the Animal Disease Incident Annex. And again, that's a networking heads-up type of approach to that. The EMA, and perhaps the EMA could speak to this too, they may request a verbal declaration from the governor that would, again, preposition or predispose resources and people in the event. At this point, it's still a potential.
And in terms of Mr. Yarsh's farm, is there an unusual amount of activity, people coming in, people going out, that at some point the neighbors are going to ask themselves, what are we seeing here?
Probably not. We want to keep activity there to a very minimum. Why? Because of spread of disease. Again, everybody who goes on that farm has the potential to carry it off if it's truly foot-and-mouth disease. So we want to keep the activity on that farm to a minimum. You know, could I be there? Yes. I've already been there. But the other thing, too, that's happening is, you know, Dr. Glauer, as a state veterinarian, has most likely already called what we call our incident management team, called some of our animal disease folks to kind of be on the ready. So we're kind of getting packed and ready to run wherever they tell us to run, so that we are able to respond as quickly as we can once we receive a diagnosis.
Mr. Yarsh, anything to add?
Probably going along with that, you would want to keep it as quiet as you can, because basically farmers are nosy.
Are?
They hear that I got a bug on my farm, they're going to come around to see what the bug looks like. And it's very true of them. I mean, it's just the characteristic of the animals. It's, you know, that's the way they are. You hear, if they hear somebody's got something, they got to go see what it is, because they don't have it, you know. And it could create a problem. So like she said, if you can keep it at a minimum, keep it under the hush-hush, you'd probably be way far ahead.
And that would be Dr. Jones's interest also, to keep the situation, if you will, under wraps?
Absolutely. And, you know, he has a requirement, you know, as far as confidentiality as a veterinarian. That's not something he can just tell everybody about, because he has to maintain confidentiality with his client.
All right. Do you want to add anything at this point, Dr. Brisker? All right. Well, here's what we've learned so far. No, I'm sorry, I'm standing with my back to you. We've heard from the farmer, Mr. Yarsh, who I think has been a great farmer, from the two obvious experts. And before we move on to the state scenario, which will be after the break, the question is, in terms of where we are locally, we open it up here to questions from the audience in terms of helping you better understand what it is that you've heard, what it is you've seen in terms of the initial three presentations. How does this all begin to play out? Yes.
I have a question on...
If I could just ask you to wait, don't move. Okay. And if I could also ask you to introduce yourself.
My name is Lori Humphrey. I wonder how much of that vague simulated newscast is in your minds at this point, as the farmer who would call a veterinarian if he saw a potentially diseased animal routinely. Are you even making a connection in your head about that very vague notice of a potential terrorism attack that is on U.S. soil now?
In my situation, I probably wouldn't even connect it with the terrorist thing. In the years that we farmed, like I say, I've been on this I'm 65. I was 6 years old when I moved there. So when we moved there, 2 weeks later, we had cattle. And just a couple of years ago, I sold my dairy out. But at the same situation, when you're around cattle and around that investment, it's like any other business. You keep a close eye. And if there's a possibility you think you've got a problem, you can notify the vet. But as far as relating it to terrorism, I wouldn't even consider it, no.
What about the state?
The state, I should say this. It does not go without notice in the state. First of all, the networking that's going on within our department with the animal industry, the state veterinarians, cadre of people, the veterinarians and the livestock inspectors. But more importantly, what's came about recently is what we have at the Emergency Operations Center called a Fusion Center. And they just officially opened within the last month or so. But see something, say something. When this type of a news media announcement would be out there, that will be picked up. And that fusion center will be sensitized then to receive any kind of information that would come in relevant to that. And just from the Department of Agriculture standpoint, we have upwards of 150 field inspectors in the various divisions, actually more than 150 in meat inspection, plant industry, dairy division. But all of these folks are sentinels, and they are there to listen and hear. And of course, all of this gets now funneled into this very good SAC, it's called, Strategic Analysis Information Center, where it's then distributed out to the appropriate state agencies, and we would receive that then as a part of our operation.
Let me ask a series of questions related to the media aspect of this. Mr. Yarish has explained that his neighbors are likely to be very interested in all the commotion going on his farm. And Dr. Dorman, you said you were going to quarantine the farm. I assume when you quarantine a farm, there will be some signs that you'll put up in the bottom of the driveway that says "Do not enter." I mean, is there visible signs of quarantine that the outside world would recognize?
No. And keep in mind, when I quarantine a farm, I am quarantining the animals and the equipment, any conveyances. I am not quarantining the people. So I do not have the authority to do that.
His neighbors can come onto the farm and gawk at the animals if they are so inclined.
If they wanted, they could come to his farm, and hopefully Mr. Yarish would discourage that or keep them to, the driveway where they're not entering the animal confinement areas.
All right. I can't imagine a way that he could do that without word getting out. And I think that is the general nature of our society with the internet and the media, that word will get out. So the question is, at this point, in a few minutes we're going to see a simulated news broadcast that assumes that word did get out. But at this point, how do you manage the possible panic and misinformation that the news and the neighbors might be spreading?
I think we really should defer to our communications director, Melanie Wilt. Maybe you could help us in that, Melanie, with answering that question.
I'm not on the panel, I'm sorry. I think we're going to get into this a little bit more.
We'll get into it later, more in depth.
Okay, well, at this stage, we wouldn't likely be it would be the exception to do an announcement that we have a highly likely case, because it is a routine matter to collect samples of a likely case. Dr. Dorman's out collecting samples all the time and shipping them to laboratories for confirmation. We wouldn't necessarily put out a news release or have a news conference saying this is a highly likely case, because it could, in effect, induce panic, and we wouldn't want to do that. So if there was word getting around, I would hope that if it made its way to a news reporter, that they would be responsible to contact Mr. Yarish or the Ohio Department of Agriculture, so that I could explain the procedure at that point. I think we would be saying that this is what we've done. Our goal is always to be transparent about the process, so that we'd educate people about the process, so that there wouldn't be any unnecessary panic at this stage.
The only thing I'd have to say about that, we know how the news media is, and if they can get a leak and start something going, they're going to do it too. So I can understand what she's saying, but how many times has stuff been said in this country over the news media, and then you find out a day or two later it's not happening? So that's a kind of a mixed bag of thought on that one.
Yeah, I want to follow up with the first question and ask Dr. Dorman or Dr. Brisker, how often would you say you are confronted with a possible foot and mouth outbreak in the state?
Foot and mouth?
Right.
Not that often, but we do. Let me.
Well, in other words, how often do you think would you think you might have a case, and so that you might want to send a sample off to Plum Island?
We get. Of course, I'll defer to Dr. Dorman. She gets calls and goes out a lot of times for these foreign animal disease diagnosticians, but blisters and that type of thing have maybe 3 or 4. I don't know how many.
I have had probably in the last 9 months, I've had one. Now, keep in mind that we have 13 foreign animal disease diagnosticians in the state, so I'm speaking from what I have seen. And I'll be real honest, I did go out to this farm and I was a little scared.
Well, so here's my question, and it follows up on the first question. That is, given the fact that we're on some sort of alert to the possibility of a terrorist activity, and it might involve this kind of terrorist activity. I'm kind of curious that no one has seems to have notified, say, the Department of Homeland Security. I have this image of, some ne'er-do-well sort of tootling across the Midwest, dropping cow chips, infected cow chips, as they go through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and points west. And so far, it seems, that this is just within the state. And so I'm just wondering, I understand the desire to kind of, be sure that there is a real threat before you cry wolf. But I'm just wondering, part of, I think, our job today is to sort of suggest modifications of the protocols for dealing with this. And I'm just wondering why no one might have just said, hey, heads up, just like the CDC might get a heads up if we have some unusual sort of infectious disease problem.
I guess we always walk a thin or a line, shall I say, between overreacting and inducing panic, or acting in the conservative way. I don't know that we would take an initiative beyond what we had in hand, so to speak, on the side of erring not to induce panic, with a highly likely, at this point in time, again, I would defer to our communications people to walk that line, but I think we'd have to be very careful about getting overreactive or putting ourselves in too far out there without a confirmation.
He did talk about the fusion center, and that does have the FBI and Homeland Security involved. So that information is shared among all the support agencies, and there's a huge list of the support agencies in our Animal Disease Incident Annex. So I actually think that at this stage, or at least towards the end of this stage, those organizations would begin at least learning of the highly likely.
Melanie, that's very true. That part of, and I don't want to speak for the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, but part of what they'll do is contact those agencies that are listed in the Animal Disease Incident Annex. And so those agencies will know, and because the federal counterpart, when I send that sample to the lab, the state and the federal are already working together. They already know. Their emergency programs in Riverdale have contacts also, I'm sure, with DHS. And again, I'm not going to speak for USDA, but they're already going to know that we sent the sample. Mel, did you want to respond?
Just that Rich Rollins from Ohio Homeland Security runs the Strategic Analysis Information Center in the base of the Ohio. He's not here, but I know enough just to speak briefly.
To your issue, the center is staffed by nearly every agency, fire chiefs, EMA, law enforcement, et cetera, public health, all operate out of this center, and they take turns. Information flows in from international, national, and state sources, including open sources. In fact, much of the information we get is from CNN and places like that. And they have software that analyzes information that comes in. And so if that piece came in, or if agriculture had a suspected case of hoof and mouth, that's one piece of information. If they tie it to something else, that somebody's dropping buffalo chips in Indianapolis, and that comes in too, then they start to put the pieces together and they go into action. And so that process in this state and in much of the country, in fact, the SAIC in Ohio is one of the first in the country to do that, is analyzing all these pieces. And so we would hope that they would be the first to catch this by putting the pieces of the puzzle, because if ag's working over here and health is working over here and EMA is working over here and information is not being shared, we tend not to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And I think that was recognized during the shootings in Columbus, where a variety of different police agencies had shootings along the interstate, and it took quite a while to put those pieces of the puzzle together. And today that wouldn't happen, because each one of those shootings would come in, and within a day or two, we'd realize that we had a pattern. And so I think the same thing would occur in this situation.
Kate Iola. I was fortunate enough a couple of weeks ago to be a guest at Plum Island, and I would like to point out they are now run by Homeland Security, so they're going to be very aware of what's happening. And I asked how many cases they get on an annual basis that they test specifically for foot and mouth, and it's on the order of some multiple hundreds. So they are getting enough testing that they're not going to want to put out an alert for each one. I did have a question for the panel whether Mr. Yarish is going to be prevented from doing any commodities trading while they're waiting for the test results to come back.
As far as what you mean by commodities? As far as
Are
selling
you
grain
talking
and
about
stuff?
grain, selling grain?
Well, most of my grain I store at the elevator uptown anyway. Once I harvest it, it goes right up to the elevator and I store it in town. So that wouldn't, and my scenario probably wouldn't affect me.
So you have no on-farm
No,
grain
I don't store
storage?
grain at home. I take it right up to the elevator and store it there. Excuse me? I can't hear you, ma'am.
Commodity brokers are very significant gossip traders, and you don't have to actually have grain to do trading. I have a commodities account, and I don't have grain.
That's correct, but there is no on-farm storage, so therefore there would be no virus contamination of that grain. Is that what you're getting at?
Oh, sorry,
Help me understand.
I didn't actually mean for physical movements of the grain. Because of the impact, the potential impact on the commodities market, if there was an outbreak, it would be an excellent opportunity for, it's the equivalent of insider trading. If you knew there was going to be an outbreak and you positioned yourself.
I guess I have to cross that bridge when I get there, because for once I have no answer.
We need a securities lawyer on this panel. Okay.
Next year. I have two related questions, and it goes back to Max's question, which has to do with where you set these thresholds. I think we all understand the dilemma, and you're sort of, which mistake would you rather make, right? Do you want to cause unnecessarily a panic, or on the other hand, do you want to sort of let things slide slowly when actually great damage is being done? And the greater the gravity of the harm, the more our sort of threshold has to sort of err on that side, right? We're not just talking about local problems. So related to that, I guess I have two questions. One is, have these procedures, not the institutionalization of them, but the threshold, has that changed since 9/11 from a public health point of view? And then related to that, one of the things I haven't heard you speak about to too much of an extent is sort of the local investigation. Let's assume that you've concluded that this really does look like foot and mouth, and you've sent it off with this high priority. Is there anything that kicks in from a local investigation standpoint, like to really investigate, okay, who was at the farm? Who came in over the last week? Get those records so that when you do have confirmation, and maybe when it's put together with another data point, that your local investigation has already sort of jump-started so that you can prevent ongoing harm of a particularly serious nature later on. Is there any activity in that category?
Maybe I could just address the first question. I think with regard to your sliding scale perspective, everything that we have been doing since 2001 has been a work in progress. We are continuing to evolve. And to say that we have changed, the whole system has changed, the whole means of addressing these areas have changed with regard even to the development, certainly to the development of the Fusion Center. We are certainly concerned always, our agency is there to promote and protect agriculture and to promote and protect public health. And we will always err in the conservative to deal with those particular objectives. I guess it would be a case-by-case basis, but I'm confident that with the Fusion Center and with the information that's gathered there, that we have the sliding scale now about where we want it to react properly, and with the degree of sensitivity that's required, maintaining the objectives for public health and protection of agriculture.
As far as the local investigation, that's part of my job. You know, I need to collect the epidemiological information that has gone on in that farm. And by that I mean what animals have moved in, what animals have moved out in the last week. And again, that does depend on the disease. With foot and mouth disease, because the incubation period does tend to be fairly short, I could probably go back in the last 30 days and ask him those type of questions. Most producers have records or a record book that says I sold these animals this day, and so I would have that opportunity, or he could give me that information at that point that tells me about those types of things. But as far as having anyone else there, no. That's part of my job, is to ask those questions and get those answers right up front.
Dr. Dorman, I'm making an assumption that since the last case of foot and mouth disease was in 1929 in the United States, that it would be highly unlikely that any veterinarian in Ohio would have seen a case unless they've seen it overseas, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So then it would seem the natural progression to me would be to maybe suspect more of a more common disease first and eliminate those before someone would think about foot and mouth disease. What would that delay? I mean, how much of a delay would that take in the actual diagnosis?
Veterinarians are, you know, obviously doctors of veterinary medicine, and they go through quite a bit of schooling, and part of that is that knowing what your differential diagnosis is. You know, sometimes when you hear hoofbeats, most of the time it is horses. Every once in a while it's a zebra, and so you still have to think about those zebras in the back of your head, even though it may be unlikely, maybe it's down on your list. But one of the things that we are taught and trained as veterinarians is if you see a vesicular disease, if you see a disease that has blisters, you better be picking up the phone, because a veterinarian, everybody loves to be famous, but a veterinarian will become infamous in a hurry if they do not diagnose foot and mouth disease, if it's the first case in the U.S. So they are very, very aware, and that's part of our job as the Ohio Department of Agriculture, is we go out and try and train many of these veterinarians and do refresher courses, and we just did one in the middle of February, where we invited practicing veterinarians in to, again, see some slides and at least see some pictures of what this disease looks like.
I've got a situation when I had my cattle, like I said before, that I had this one cow that was drooling. And the reason I picked up on it, because the one farm magazine I got a week or two before described pretty much what to look for with hoof and mouth. So I called my veterinarian, and he came over, and he says, well, he says, I have never seen a case. So he says, I'm not really sure. He says, just all the ramifications. So I give him that article, and he looked it over, did what he had to do. Within 10 hours, he called me back. He says, everything's okay, you don't have to worry. So he was right on top of it, even though he'd never seen it.
I hope I'm not beating a dead horse, and I apologize for the pun, but dead cow. But you know, we have different threat levels, you know, orange, whatever, yellow, green, red. Assuming that the first announcement we heard created a heightened threat level, does that change how you folks might respond to this kind of thing, or is it a pretty standard response, you know, irrespective of what that kind of federal sort of warning might be?
In the context of the CAS system, we would respond pretty much in those particular accelerated modes. I guess I would defer perhaps to EMA with regard to that overall threat level. Have you, in dealing with that specific contingency?
And I'll speak for Homeland Security, and even though they're not here. So what little I know is that the threat system, the red, yellow, orange thing, has been revised so that it's more industry specific. So I would think that if we found that we had a threat, that there was some kind of, this was a human caused type of incident, that you would see some type of threat level increase for the agricultural industry only. And so it wouldn't affect transportation, and it wouldn't affect, when they first adopted this process, we go to orange and everything shuts down and everybody's scared to death. And so certainly we have learned much since 2001. And so now I would think that based on the information we know up to this point in the scenario, you might see a threat level for agriculture raised.
Another thing to keep in mind is that I know me personally as the foreign animal disease diagnostician, my response is not going to be any different if it were intentional versus a natural occurrence. You know, we are ready to respond. The difference then is, you know, later as we have a confirmed diagnosis is whether, and again, are my activities going to be any different? No, the difference is Tony Brizzolera is going to be standing next to me if it's a terrorist incident. Tony is with FBI, and by mentioning his name, you already know that we've at least played together before. You know, we're in the same sandbox, and so it's not like we don't know these people. It's not like we have not addressed these types of situations before.
I got one question for you. Now, for the young lady, when you say you got your cattle on pasture, like I pastured my cattle when I had my herd. Now, there was times I'd get up in the morning and there was deer out there with them cattle. Now, they're basically, the same family. Now, is there a chance then deer could pick that up and transmit it?
Yes. Deer can get foot and mouth disease. I will tell you in the UK, in the United Kingdom, and that's the most recent activity that we've really had in the world, in 2001, they did not, and they have red-tailed deer in the UK, is my understanding, and they did not do anything with their deer population and still eradicated the disease.
I just wondered, because, you know, like I say, around our place, there's 10, 15 of them every morning looking in the back window. So if they're here today and gone tomorrow, is they're going to take it to the neighbor's farm? That would be my concern, which they probably could do, right?
There's certainly that potential. Again, in the UK, we eradicated it without doing anything with the deer herd. So
well, maybe again, you need to take care of their own.
I can't really answer that.
Just to understand the possible realities of this type of situation, and I don't want to give any terrorist groups an idea, but how might terrorists inject hoof and mouth disease into the grain supply or into the animal livestock in Northeast Ohio? What are all the different avenues that a terrorist could attempt such an incident as we're talking about today?
Well, there's a number, and we have done as part of our emergency preparedness vulnerability assessments, and those. We have done vulnerability assessments, and of course those types of things we keep pretty close to the vest. But probably when you consider national or international assemblies of livestock, exhibitions, those types of things, this virus being carried by aerosol, airborne means, that might be one of the ways that would be an entry point into the thing. Dr. Dorman.
He's asking me to think like a terrorist, and I can do that probably. Probably choose not to, but there certainly are many ways that foot and mouth disease could come to this country, and if someone wanted to intentionally do that, do I think they could? I do. And would it be difficult? No, it wouldn't. And I even hate to think about, you know, if some country decided to weaponize foot and mouth disease, because obviously there's your everyday viruses, and then there are certainly weaponized forms of diseases, whether it be bacteria or viruses. And, you know, could a disease get other properties or maybe kill more animals? Potentially. You know, I have no idea what could happen with that. I can't really speak to that, so.
Thank you. A couple of minutes ago, the gentleman here mentioned Homeland. Did you mean the state component, or did you mean the federal?
I was speaking specifically to Ohio Homeland.
Okay, thanks.
Are there additional questions? All right, then what we're going to do now is take a 20-minute break, reconvene at 10:45 to 11. Please don't be late. Thank you very much. This was great.